Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the 2020 Inclusioneers Transform Conference. I am Lucretia Dillard, and I'm here with co-host Crystal, and we're going to be sharing with you our training support regarding empowering and transforming children's early experiences, a culturally responsive lens to inclusion. I am Lucretia Beard, and I am a lead mental health consultant, also a professor, also a clinician of the past 28 years, and I'm so happy to be presenting to you all today. And I want to welcome to introduce herself, Crystal, my co-host today. Hi, Crystal.
Hello there, Cree. It's so great to be here with you today and to be back with the Inclusion Conference. I have been associated with the conference for many years, and I have been in early childhood for more than 25 years. And prior to that, worked at university settings as well as high school teaching. So I have been in education at different age levels. And I'm a mother living in Richmond, California, with my husband and 3 sons. So let's talk about our plan for today. We really hope that you all enjoy the presentation and take away several things that can help in your thinking and in your practice. And so there are 3 ways that we are thinking about our time together. Our plan today includes just a very beginning of an understanding and awareness of racism, implicit bias, and oppression, leading us as an early childhood field to a more equitable and essential inclusion practice. Secondly, one of the really big areas is how can we learn to apply a culturally responsive approach as we explore and even analyze data that we see on disproportionate and equitable inclusion policies and practices. And in that, we want to pivot to ways to empower and transform the lived experiences of young children. Our third is a call to action, inviting you into critical self-reflection and into action to transform, again, the lived experience of children from marginalized communities who may or may not be living with a disability. So as we get started, one of the things that we really wanted to invite each of you in an interactive way, even in this virtual experience, is to engage with us, to really be tuned in, to be present and intentional in your own learning. We know that in this day and time, the virtual learning platform is really taking over so many of our professional lives, and we really just invite you to lean in and just remember, sometimes it's better to just mindfully be than to rush to think about what you're going to do with this information. To think about it as a way to shift and expand our worldviews and think about how we can increase our ability to lean in and tune in different ways. One really big caution that Lucretia and I always have in our training when we're working with adult learners is to be mindful of our own past experiences, our triggers, and our bias, but not be directed by them. To just notice them and to think about, what is my plan to take care of myself? And do I have any physiological feeling in my mind, in my body, in my spirit? And we encourage you to think about ways to, again, take care of yourself, to think about something that brings you more of a calming or self-regulation. So these reactions that we might be feeling are actually really valuable windows. And for those of you that know this work around equity and inclusion, we want you to just think about those as, again, windows, the metaphor mirrors and windows into our personal values and our beliefs, and also as a way to just offer an opportunity to strengthen our self-awareness, because we know that that self-awareness is really the foundation for a transformative learning process. So with that, we want to make sure that no one feels guilty about who they are, what they know, or even what you believe to be true. However, we do invite you to take responsibility to expand your understanding of the way society is structured in ways that privilege some individuals and some groups, and in other ways marginalize and oppress others. As you all have probably noticed, one of the things that we really want to bring out in our approach today in our presentation is an equity lens or an equity orientation. We as human beings all possess a universal need to be seen, to be heard, to be empathized with. And so this is just a reminder to hone your skills to advance equity across the entire early childhood system. And so, with that, being equity driven or taking on an equity approach for me really means that words matter and words have meaning. They really, that I'm inviting all of us to mind our words because we know that our language choices really have a powerful potential to create a feeling of us versus them, where sometimes we label someone as disabled when we know that children of different abilities share many of the same experiences and many of the same interests and ideals as people who are not with a disability. So knowing that we all have common experiences allows us to then think about what are our beliefs about people that are different than us and what are our actions and our behaviors, and how do we then think about ways to come up with solutions and ways to come together to have a more equitable society. And because we all have our own culturally worldview based on how we were raised, our ethnic background, or even our environment, we want to be able to think about how have we been socialized to think of ourselves either as part of a dominant group or in a minoritized group, because this definitely influences the way that we see ourselves, but also how we see issues of equality and inequality. So, because all of us are imperfect in our learning and this is a lifelong work, we want to just invite all of us to show respect and regard for topics such as race, diversity, culture, oppression, and equity. One really important point is that this entire approach is about lifting up what is good and what is an asset and a strength for children, to acknowledge and affirm the wide range of skills that we all have, our knowledge, our creativity, and our brilliance, and use this as acts of resilience and resistance so that we can cope and strive and be the best that we can for our children, families, and communities. A couple of other final points I want to make about this is that we want to be able to use person-first language. And for those of you that are very deeply passionate about inclusive work, we know that we want to define people in their entire humanity and put the person first instead of defining them based on a condition that they have, because that can be overgeneralizing, stereotyping, and stigmatizing. So let's first identify ourselves by who we are, and then with whatever their condition might be. Lastly, the metaphors, mirrors, and windows is something that in our equity work, when we do longer trainings, that we really talk about as mirrors as ways for us to connect with each other, to be able to see each other in terms of what we have in common, but also windows as a glimpse into someone else's perspective, into their world, their value systems, and use that information as resources to interrupt some of our own ideas about how other people exist in the world. As a data point, we wanted to be able to mention to you that nearly half of people that are killed by police have a disability report. We found this information really important because when we think about some of the dire situations that some young men, young women find themselves in, there a lot of times is a missing element that we don't hear about in the media nearly enough. And as you see on the screen, you see a few headlines that have actually, unfortunately, been fairly recent in the last year or two. And in a moment, we're going to hear a story, Krisha, around a child who knew for himself that he was different and that made him strong and in some ways seen very differently, but that indeed he and his mother were really trying to advocate and to bring more awareness to this. So the reality is that this is far too common. And if you Google this or just have been watching the headlines, you realize that this is something that all of us should care about. And these statistics really cause us to have pause. So Cree is going to give us a little snapshot of one of these stories, Elijah McClain. And from there, we're going to talk about what are the intersecting factors when we talk about people that are experiencing a disability and children of color.
Absolutely, Crystal. So, off of Elijah McClain's recent death, we know that he was a different learner. And many mothers have this feeling of unrest since his story aired in the news. And unfortunately, his plight, based on his difference of having a different neurodiverse brain and sensitivities, that go along with his behaviors, police were unable to detect that he had a developmental need and had profiled him based on a call they had received regarding suspicious man in the neighborhood. So, of course, many children of color with neurodiverse differences and on the autism spectrum definitely have behaviors that are different. And so, this mother, Cherie, 5 years old, she puts out a call to action to really educate us about what's color being profiled based on their behaviors, and that we really are misunderstanding what is happening in the community regarding this type of brutality, where Black and brown skin is being synchronized with criminality. And so for children with different developmental needs and social needs, they often will present behavior that might appear aggressive to other people. Again, having sensitivities to light, noise, sound, and touch, maybe not having a lot of expressive language and being able to communicate eloquently to someone what's happening around them, having sensory integration, processing needs, might very well show up to other people as aggressive behavior or suspicious behavior because those behaviors go misunderstood. And Jim McClain and so many children in the world, boys and girls who are different learners and have different abilities, we need to really be understanding what those needs are and how their behaviors might show as aligned with their needs, and not be profiling based on bias of what we think we're seeing, but really have a different approach to addressing what could be happening with these children being profiled in this way. So the question is, how many children are different? And Crystal's going to share with us a little bit more of how we should really, think about what's happening in the community. That I am different, and many of us are different. No two brains are alike. And so, Crystal, share with us more about what we should be thinking about in terms of how we can support children.
Sure. Thanks, Cree. You know, when I hear that story, it brings up some of my own past experiences, just my own beliefs and my own attitudes. As a former family child care provider, I remember when I would get a call from the resource and referral program, and they would say, "Are you ready? Are you equipped to take on a child who has a different learning need, who just has a need for additional supports?" And I remember being so nervous and ambivalent. And I have to say that because some of us have been in those vulnerable positions. And I wanted to ask you all to weigh in right now and to share with us in your chat box. What do you think about when you hear about children or students with a disability and they're headed into your program or into your classroom? So if you don't mind, just sharing a little bit of either what you think about now or what you may have thought before. And what do you think about when you hear about that particular child and they're also a member of a marginalized group? So those two things together, we would really love to hear what you would like to say about that so we can hear a little bit in the chat. So we'll give you a few seconds. So let me read some of the responses here. Scared and I don't relate to them. I get nervous. I think that they might harm other children that I'm caring for. Okay. Parents might be concerned that their child may not get enough attention because the teacher might spend all their time with the special needs of that child. Yes, yes. Okay. The education and activities in the classroom or in the home program might be slower because of that child's special needs. Okay, and another one says there's something wrong with their family lifestyle, or it might be the result of drugs passed through pregnancy or an urban environment. Okay, so we can see that even when those of us who have been trained and who work in the field of early education or in policy or in administration, that we all have visceral feelings that we have to come to grips with. And I think right now, particularly with everything we're experiencing in society with COVID-19 and other pandemics that are happening globally, the need for responsive early childhood programs is even greater right now. For us to really think about how can we create a welcoming, inclusive, and strength-based environment that are responsive to the unique needs of young children and families, for those who have a disability and those who maybe do not have. So I think that this is important because raising the level of awareness is one of our goals for today. And I feel like it's something that, again, is lifelong work for us to think about what are the connections between diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And because we are taking an equity approach, we wanted to make sure that the ways that we make meaning of these terms are very clear for you in the audience. And so equity for us in this presentation really is about every child receiving what they need to develop into their fullest academic and social potential. And in that, we also mean that it eliminates the predictability of their success or their failure that currently correlates with any social or cultural factors. And so the goal with that is to interrupt all inequitable practices, examining our biases, which we'll touch on in a little bit, and creating an inclusive and just condition for all. So we are going to move on into a discussion about what that might mean and how we might be able to look at it by looking at the intersection of disabilities and equitable outcomes. So what I'd like you to do, if you're taking notes or you might have a journal or a notebook, is just consider what is our role in early childhood in eradicating the systemic inequity for some young children's lived experiences. So we know that we have policies on paper, we have procedures that we try to follow, yet and still, we know that the data lets us know that students that are from minoritized or marginalized communities are often oppressed, and there are a lifelong circumstance in some cases. So I want us to think about what is the consequence of the current process of assessing children who have been diagnosed with some learning difference and they're also a child of color. What's the consequence? Another question I'd like to bring about is how can we explain the behaviors and the learning outcomes that we see in the data and in the research? And along with that, how is the dominant narrative in America related to bias and discrimination? How does that help account for some of what we're seeing? And as we saw earlier with the headlines, why are some young boys of color in particular, both with and without a disability, disproportionately placed in danger, disciplined, and even killed? And so in the sociological literature and research, we see this idea of intersectionality as a framework to understand, explore, and even analyze these questions. And so if it's something that you're interested in, I encourage you to look for books, articles. There are YouTube videos on this idea of intersectionality. And so I want to refer specifically to an article from 2018 on race and disability. And it's entitled From Analogy to Intersectionality. And sociologists actually pointed out that race and disability as an intersecting factor for some children and even adults is a neglected area. So I think it's something for us to think about as we examine our policies and procedures. The framework of disability rights has been literally racialized. in ways that center the experiences of white, middle class, disabled Americans, really likening it to ableism, to likening it to how ableism links to racial oppression. So when we think about young boys of color, for example, who might have a learning difference, there are serious impacts that we should be paying attention to that give us cause to re-examine what are the policies and procedures that are really impacting this child's lived experience. Researchers have argued in this particular article that the experiences of disabled people of color has been masked in terms of the processes by which whiteness and able-bodiedness has marginalized and been has been privileged in these respective movements. So again, just thinking about how can we move toward more inclusive, welcoming environments, this is just something to give us more information and more ways to understand this problem. So let's turn to some of the topics, again, that are complex, and we could spend many days in training and in study on these, and we're always learning. And I wanted to just introduce a little bit about how race is defined and how we think about it in this presentation. We know that this is a social construct, that race is a classification that historically came about from white Europeans that used whiteness as the model for humanity, and really for the purpose of establishing and maintaining privilege and power. So many people think that race is defined simply by the physical attributes, but that's not the entire story. We see here that race is constructed physically, yes, but also socially, legally, and historically. I want to read to you a really quick quote that Milner in 2017 said that I think really captures this idea. And this says, the meanings, the messages, the results, and the consequences of race are developed and constructed by human beings, not by genetics or some predetermined set of scientific laws. Genetically and biologically, individuals are more the same than they are different. There's no biologically sustainable reason for establishing races as distinct subgroups within the human species. Race is a concept created in the modern era as a way of drawing distinctions between people such that some might benefit at the expense of others. So I think that that quote in a lot of ways helps us to remember what race is really about. And so remember that there's a physical, a social, a legal, and historical component where judgments are made. And I think we all need to be mindful of those judgments, and that there is no scientific theory that lets us know that there is such a thing as race. So let's go a little bit further. So what does it mean to work for race at different levels? Well, again, the study of race and race equity, racism, oppression, implicit bias, we know that we don't have the time that we would like to really talk about it, but I thought it might be useful as we move into empowering and transforming young children's lives, especially with regard to inclusive, welcoming environments for young children, that we should think about what does it mean to work for race equity. So we see that there are 4 quadrants here, and I want to draw our attention to the top left, structural racism, a very specific form of oppression that is particularly experienced by young children of color. So sometimes it's referred to as systemic racism or structural racialization. It's defined as a disproportional marginalization for people of color, and it runs across our institutions. So individuals that are participating in these institutions, and I'll give you some examples of what those institutions are in just a moment. Sometimes people that are operating within those institutions don't necessarily see themselves as racist or participating in practices that are racist. However, they might actually unconsciously, unknowing, be participating in practices or policies that are perpetuating racist systems. And so again, we want to be mindful that this idea is about providing benefits to certain groups over others. And that's how it leads to racial inequalities in the opportunities and the experiences that some children experience across many systems in society. So let's just look at a few examples of what are some of these institutions. So we can see that in structural racism, that there are many institutions. So we know that institutional racism is one form and there are many forms. And so it's important for us to be working hard at addressing all forms of racism. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to just highlight a few examples of the systems that we see on the slides. So we know that transportation, law enforcement, education, healthcare, banking, all of these institutions really are places where we can see an equitable policies, practices, lived experience. So we have to think about all of it in totality. So let's really think about what is at play and why these systems are so harmful. So what's really at play here and what makes this such an important and also challenging topic for some of us to grapple with based on our positionality in the world or how we are in relation to people who have unearned privilege or those of us who might be representative of marginalized or oppressed communities. So when you take apart the term racism, we get the ism right after the term race. And therein lies this idea of oppression or the systemic and prolonged mistreatment of a group of people based on race. And oppression is so challenging and can be experienced in such challenging ways because it's a system that's built into our everyday life. So for me as a Black woman, it's not something that I can wake up and shake off or forget about. It's just part of my everyday existence. And it shapes all of the systems that we're in now, the systems that we just noticed as examples on the last slide. So when those systems are all operating together in education, in healthcare, in housing, and so on, and at every level, from policies, practices, your everyday interactions and behaviors, then it's no wonder that there is so much work for all of us to do and why this is such a challenging idea for us to grapple with. But this is really at the heart of what we're talking about. So in childhood education, like all other sectors and all other structures, has a place and we all have a role because we know oppression impacts the learning for children, our teaching in the early childhood workforce, our leading at all levels of leadership and policy and decision making. And so it's something for us to all be paying attention to. And addressing oppression and bias raises strong emotions, as I mentioned earlier. So again, it's really important for us to think about how we can work together and think about what's needful for each of ourselves in terms of healings, because we've all been impacted by the effects of oppression. And so let's think for just a minute about how our natural judgments, our biases, and our own natural preferences and tendencies lead to what we know as racism and oppression in our society. So again, implicit bias or unconscious bias, as some people would call it, is a very big topic. And it is really something for all of us to consistently not only do kind of intellectual or an academic study, but also just thinking about our own attitudes, the way that we were raised, and how we've been socialized. So I wanted to bring to, as an example of one way to think about this, is a little snapshot in a very landmark experiment that happened in the 1930s and early 40s on children's self-perception related to race. The Clark couple, Kenneth and Mamie, as you see on the screen, was very interested in what was the self-perception and the regard for themselves for children, young children, that were in segregated schools and classrooms and those who were in integrated classrooms. And this study really changed the way that we looked at race relations, and it really helped us to think about how are we, just beginning as young children, unconsciously absorbing prejudice, negative feelings toward people of color, but also how have these internalized beliefs really shaped our values, our attitudes, and our behaviors. So as you're watching this, I just want you to just think about your own role wherever you are in terms of early childhood, and think about what strikes you and what might seem confusing or alarming for you. And if you've seen this before, I'm curious to know what you might see or hear differently this time around. So sit back and I'll join you in just a few more minutes.
¿Cuál muñeco es bonito? ¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Cuál muñeco es malo?
Ninguno.
¿Cuál muñeco es malo?
Este.
¿Y por qué?
Porque, bueno, este es moreno y este es blanco.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Por qué?
Porque a mí no me gusta el color café.
¿Cuál muñeco te gusta más?
Este.
¿Cuál muñeco es bueno?
Este.
¿Y por qué?
Porque no me dan miedo los güeros porque tengo más confianza con si los un poco más así como este. No tengo mucha confianza.
¿Cuál muñeco es malo? ¿Por qué?
No sé.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo?
Este. No sé, es que me parece que está un poquito, ¿cómo te diría? Más moreno y no se ve tan blanco. Y no tiene mucho aspecto.
¿Por qué el muñeco blanco es bueno?
Porque sus ojos son azules y todo su cuerpo es blanco.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Por qué?
Porque está negro.
¿Por qué ese muñeco es malo?
Porque está café.
¿Y por qué que este café es malo?
Porque pega.
¿Cuál muñeco te gusta más?
Blanco. Porque sus ojos están bonitos y su raza también.
¿Cuál muñeco se parece más a ti?
Un poquito a este. Es que soy un poquito güerita de mis piernitas y de mis aquí, de mi espalda y de mi carita y mis bracitos los tengo morenitos.
¿Cuál muñeco se parece más a ti?
Este.
¿En qué?
Las orejas. Sí, vamos.
Wow. Every time I see that video, I see and hear something even more striking than the times before. And when our internalized self-identities are nurtured by what we see and the messages we're told, as we can see here in this video, our own implicit bias and how important it is to cultivate positive social identities for all children. And again, we saw a variety of children in this video, and their comments were fairly consistent. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we not increasing the educational outcomes for children of color? And is now going to take us into a really important exploration about the importance of culture.
Thank you, Crystal. That video is so powerful. Why culture? And culture needs to be an important lens on all levels of education. And the reason why, in particular, we need to be unapologetic about really focusing on children of color, considering the adversities that children of color are facing, especially children who have different abilities, disabilities, and have special needs. because they are other and most vulnerable in an additional way of adversity. And we know that it's going to be our job to promote this social change and be able to look at culture on all levels of education, to retrain ourselves to really think about culture and really help us to support children and identifying themselves in a more true and positive way. We want to be able to do this in a deliberate way, and that's why a lens of culture and responsibility to culture for us to be able to meet their needs, as well as encompass an ability to empower them to reframe identities of themselves and increase their self-efficacy as they go through education. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at in this slide is this idea of what's problematic regarding this universal phenomenon of trying to frame this inclusion process as it pertains to young children and early. For years, the medical model has used diagnoses to prescribe that doctors know what is best, meaning that doctors have looked at issues related to children's needs and their overall development. And the question that they often ask is, what with you? And so we really need to be moving from that medical model away from just individualized treatment by professionals. And this needs to be a whole inclusion model where we move past the medical and the social model and really look at culture as an additional third leg to supporting children of all. And so in the social model, this other phenomenon makes it seem as if the issues that are going on with children with developmental needs pertains to them being in an urban situation, meaning that it might be socially created. It might be because they're from a different socioeconomic class. It might be because of the attitudes and the political issues surrounding them. But this again is a model that lacks acknowledgement of cultural responsibility. You know, being different or having different abilities, being disabled does not mean that this is an urban issue. And we need to be looking at these sorts of issues as they impact children's ability to be able to perform in school and have straight-based services that support them. We need to be looking at this intersection, as Crystal said, between disability and race and ethnicity and culture. And this is so important because people really do come with a plethora of ways of seeing ourselves, not just in the biological form or the individual form or the social form, but also our cultural needs, meaning our rituals, our languages, the origins in which we come from, and also the types of needs that we have in our communities that help us to achieve our goals. It's really important for us to be thinking about and to consider the types of adversities that children of color face every single day. And so what we know is that there needs to be true consideration to issues related to racism, as it is a major adversity issue in our community, and how this continues to focus on the disparaging plight of children of color. We know that failure to name racism results in classifying issues and challenges in the quest of inclusive and equitable education as classified as this urban issue. And we need to be taking on a new framework of seeing what's going on with children as what has happened to them as being the more important role as educators. Of being able to support children and families. And so being at that front line, that upfront seat in their lives, we need to really be conscientious about how we name their needs. Another level of consideration is really looking at services and interventions for children. We know that the IEP process is really focused on, naming goals and objectives for children, and usually that is from a very clustered focus. And so it definitely involves a team, but does it really enlist the family as the CEO of what needs to happen with their children? It really is important for us to aid in communication processes that elevate those conversations with children's families around relationship building of how services should be implemented. Often IEP processes may filibuster families with their agenda that doesn't really meet the need of the family. And so it's really important to have deeper discussions about services and interventions and how they really might imply negative results for children. We need to be having these deeper conversations around helping families to really incorporate the needs that they have and not be so around what's happening with racism. We really need to identify the impact of children as they have to grow throughout the rest of their lives, and they need these plans to be aligned with their specific needs around culture and education and health. So we need to be empowering children. We need to be deliberate about being able to be humane and create practices in which we can help young children have these new early experiences of positive identity to be able to increase their self-efficacy and their ability to cope through life, through adversity, as there is institutional and structural racism as the fabric of this country. So it's really important for us to be empowering them as an aid in fortitude to provide them with the process of learning how to have self-compassion for themselves and also being able to cope through these types of adversities. And it really requires educators to put sort of cultural responsive lens as a way to really include that child's culture and how they see themselves. Developing cultural awareness is extremely important as educators as the first step to being able to really have insight into children. It's really important that we think about cultural awareness and it involves recognizing these different beliefs and values and customs that other people may have. We know that we are now treating many children that do not look like us, and the focus needs to be on them instead of us being able to just focus on our agenda as educators. We really need to be providing that inclusive model that looks at that awareness of how our own identities and our ethnicity and our cultural stance impacts the children that we serve. Having this cultural awareness gives us the ability to respect and notice differences, and it gives us the ability to align those differences in the educational and instructional process. It also helps us to build relationship with the family in order to really increase those self-efficacy skills that can be aligned with routines at home. Showing sensitivity and differences and welcoming others to share their cultural experiences is not just a way to celebrate and showcase who they are. It's really to help them have that self-compassion and identity to be able to explore those cultural needs in the educational system. We all know that we need more involved in being able to increase those cultural experience education and not just leaving it to the family to host those experiences for children. We know children are more aligned and attached to educators who involve themselves from a cultural lens. Developing this cultural awareness means that we have to really look at the disconnect. There often are discontinuities between a fit of an educator and a child, and that really means using that awareness to really identify the lack of connection that we have with children first. It means that we really need to be understanding and be open-minded to build that relationship so that we can understand children of color more. Instead of being misunderstood, they really need to have that connection, that heartfelt connection where we see them from a cathartic place. Educators must have a clear understanding of their own cultural identity and how that impacts their attitudes towards children that they serve. And better yet, it really helps to understand how the child feels up under our direction. If we're from a dominant culture, it's really important to be able to understand that there's a link between the greater world and how the child sees themselves under this dominant culture. It's so important for us as special educators and as early educators to understand where the process of developing culture impacts the child, how it serves them in their educational process. This means that we really have to be looking at functions that we create that either promote or do not promote cultural identity in our educational processes and instruction. I have a little story that I want to share with you about a little boy that I have serviced for many years. And this speaks to this discontinuity and lack of fit that we need to be examining with educators. So his name is Demetrius, and he's cared for by his grandmother. And Demetrius, unfortunately, has not had consistent experience as an early learner in family childcare. Demetrius is an African American boy who is 4 years old, and Demetrius has been to about 4 different family childcare providers. His newest family childcare provider, Mary, has only had him for just about a week, and she's concerned that she might not be able to continue to care for him. So with Mary, she had involved the grandmother in a brief conference to share with her that she thought that she might not be able to continue to care for Demetrius. And some of the needs that he had, she expressed that he did not give eye contact, that he had low expressive language, that he did not speak in the context of the same language as her, and that he also was socially inept. He had difficulty engaging with his peers, and as of recently had snatched a train their child. She was concerned that by age 4 that he did not exhibit any skills for pro-social play. And because of his lack of language and his inability to connect with children and adults, that she thought that she was definitely a disconnect for him, and that she might be giving notice very soon for Demetrius. Well, Mary, unfortunately, did not take the time to give this child much time to be in the care. And so the grandmother really tried to advocate for Demetrius and let her know that Demetrius had already been to 4 different family child providers who had basically said much of the same, that because these were behaviors that they did not like or misunderstood, that they were unable to provide Demetrius with that child-centered approach. So one of the things that we want to be thinking about, I'll open up the chat and you can definitely respond now, is some of the things that I want you to think about is that it appears that Mary is really deficit driven in this particular vignette. And she's focused on behaviors that she really does not like. And rarely has she expressed some of Demetrius's strengths. So what would be important aspects of Demetrius's life that would be important to consider? So we're going to put our early educator brain builder hats on and we're going to think together. And I'll open up the chat and I'll look for your responses. So I'll give you a few minutes to put your thoughts together. Okay, so I see that some of the chat responses are coming in, and some of you are wondering, where is Demetrius's father and mother? Some of you are wondering what other providers have done that have been helpful. Some of you are wondering what are some of the things that Demetrius has, some of the questions that we could ask his grandmother that might help build his interest at his new family childcare. That's a very good question. Some of you are wondering what sorts of sensory needs Demetrius might have, and would pictures and other visuals be helpful in drawing him in to increase his attachment skills. And some of you are wondering how to have a conversation with Mary about helping children to adjust, that it's quite a bit of time to adjust. Some of you have put a cultural lens of wondering, more about Demetrius's background and what sorts of things and activities does his grandmother expose him to that are helpful, that Mary could be thinking about and including in the family child care process. And those are all really good chat questions to be considering. And you're absolutely right to be able to put on that cultural lens that we need to be asking more specific questions about Demetrius's life to be able to increase that connection between Demetrius and Mary. And I also agree with you all that giving Demetrius more time to adjust in a new setting and not forcing him because he might be having some needs around attachment building. And also wondering about those visuals that might be supportive to Demetrius. What types of things is he exposed to at home might be very well culturally driven ideas that Mary could incorporate in her family child care instructional process or in relationship building with Demetrius. Using this culturally responsive lens in teaching definitely means that we have to be first building to the children we serve in our communities. We have to be thinking of ourselves as family liaisons. To be able to build community and relationships means to get involved and have more deeper conversations about specific to the child and their needs, not just what their abilities are, but also what things bring them joy, what types of things are they attached to, strength building ideas from families because they know their children best and they know that they might be able to help in that process of building those rituals or those schedules with those children. Being able to look at our learning standards and have more cultural consideration in the way that we assess children. What language does their family speak? What sorts of practices and the way that they might learn at home? Is it more kinesthetic and more hands-on? What ways is learning expressed in the home? And what types of activities that the family might be doing to encourage social skill building? To be able to bridge those conversations with children and families is really, really helpful in helping them to build up their characteristics as new learners in our programs. We have to be able to align our instruction with relevant experiences that allow individuals to interact with children with different family traditions. How about hosting a cultural potluck at your family child care or early intervention setting? How about involving parents to volunteer to be able to share something unique about their family with other children? Children learn best to identify themselves and others when we give them opportunities to learn in many different ways. And as we know, young children learn through practice over and over again. That repetition of being able to present new items and share out with children really expands their ability to understand differences amongst themselves and with their peers. Aligning our instruction means opening those experiences and making them way more relevant to the child that we're serving. And that means maybe hosting ideas where children can share food that they like at home, or they can share those experiences, recent vacations, places that they've gone to, conversations and stories that are in their families. Aligning those needs really increases self-efficacy, and it really helps children to identify their own power sources regarding their own self-efficacy. Understanding ways to create learning environments that allow individuals to retain and appreciate their own identity, and helps them to understand that there are many different cultural heritages, and it increases our ability to appreciate other people. We know that there's that universal concept that not only are we important, but that we're acknowledged and that we're appreciated. And using this cultural lens builds that ability to be seen and have those cathartic experiences throughout our life. Those are the types of experiences that increase a child's ability to attach and bond in their early childhood settings. And it really does promote them having a more positive self-identity. A culturally responsive lens also means that we need to understand the specific ways in which cultures have been stereotyped. And this means those negative images that children have to succumb to in school and also in society. We need to be aware of ways that we can strategize how to really help children cope through this type of adversity. It means expanding our awareness and having compassion for what's happening to children. And it definitely means continuing to increase our journey of understanding how racism impacts children in an institutional, instructional way. We really need to be disrupting those barriers of stereotyping and prejudice that increase children's inner critic of themselves and causes psychological harm. The only way to do that is really to understand those issues of bias, and also look for ways that you can identify what's good and best in every child. Being able to refute bias means to look at what's good and best in every child and really help them to identify that through real descriptive praise of them. Being able to identify specific things that they do well, help them cope in areas where they need to compensate, and really, really showcase in a cathartic and mirroring way that you love and care about them. And ways to do that is really to identify what's good and best. To be over-correcting and over-directing of children will not increase that social. It's really a place from the heart in which we need to really socially engage children and meet them where they are. If a child is not able to speak at a high level with expressive language or reciprocal language, it's really important to use those visual cues of them and learn from their family in ways that they communicate this in not just verbal but nonverbal ways. Being able to build up the self-esteem and challenge those inner critic views of that are negative and stereotypical of children is really going to help them through this plight of adversity, because racism is alive and well, and children will have to learn how to cope through those microaggressions in life. We need to be able to identify these barriers that enlist and that help us to not enlist partnerships. We really need to be looking at our own situatedness around our own culture and our own ethnicity, and how that might be a barrier to establishing with families. We need to be looking at ways to decrease those types of tensions and really open ourselves up in a compassionate way to be able to engage more social emotionally with families. We have to be able to promote and celebrate all ways that we engage with children, and it's really important to share their life stories and their experiences in the learning content and in instructional practices. So this is an era of transformation, you all. It's so important that we be deliberate about how we're going to move forward and be able to process what we've learned today, as this is our new journey to move forward and adopt and challenge ourselves to be deliberate about ways that we're going to engage children from a cultural responsive lens. This doesn't mean that we need to overthink. It just really means that we're going to practice this ability to be mindful and really engage families on a deeper level and not just be in proximity of families. It means that we're going to raise the bar as early educators. It is our ability to provide this level of social change. It is not a top-down approach. We know that social change happens from the local level, and as we increase our ability to engage children of color at a high level and be able to disband this old framework of inclusion and really open up ideas of inclusion regarding being more culturally responsive. And that way we can provide fortitude and healing for many of those regressions and barriers that race causes. We can be a beacon of hope to be able to press on and help children learn adversity through these types of traumas. And we can definitely support families in being able to be more expressive about their needs. So there's a whole systems approach to being able to support children. We know that when we see children from a deeper place, that it is reciprocal. And in that base language, it increases children's ability to trust and to feel safe. And so we hope that you have enjoyed this training, and we are so thankful that you could have been anywhere else in the world, but you decided to come and be with us today. So the challenge is ours, and we hope to see you in the near future at one of our other trainings. Take good care.